Hello, welcome to Connotation Points Video Snark. This video series isn't an audiobook, it's designed as commentary. This series emphasizes reading and listening comprehension skills. If you thought that this was an audiobook, maybe stick around and learn something. I also want to know why you thought that this was an audiobook, because no matter how many times that I say up front that this is a detailed book review, people still get upset that this isn't an audiobook. What made you click on this? My focus is on reading books, discussing what went wrong, and suggesting ways that they could be fixed. I picked up a book at random for my next YouTube read. Hope that this one's good, or at least interesting. Anyway, Garden Spells by Sarah Addison Allen. Let's jump into it, shall we? Part 1, Hindsight, Chapter 1. Right away, I have to comment that we're introduced to an awful lot of run-on sentences. I feel like there is a time and place for the occasional one, but within the first paragraph, we're completely bombarded with them. The prose does seem exceptionally flowery, though, so maybe it's a little forgivable, even if I do forget what happened at the start of the sentence by the time it reaches the end. We're introduced to Claire, who is a witch. She tells us that her life was a lot of waiting around for her mother as she hooked up with random men in bars, of stealing candy from her little sister. That her life before her sister was born was of waiting around for her mother to produce what was needed, mittens for the winter and money for bills. That life on the run had been good enough for Claire, but Lorelai obviously thought Sydney deserved better, and Sydney deserved to be born with roots, and the small, scared child in Claire hadn't been able to forgive her. Nor do I think that this is something that should be forgiven, because your mother actively chose to tell you that you weren't good enough for stability. The fact that even as an adult Claire is still holding on to all this is honestly pretty telling. Claire wakes up in the garden after a bout of dreams that brought back all of that to the surface. If you couldn't tell from the title, the themes of this revolve around plants. The apple tree in the corner of the yard was shivering slightly, and that tells Claire that she needs to be on the lookout for something in the near future. Going inside, she tells the readers that she inherited an old family home from her grandmother. She now runs her business from the stuff she grows in her garden, but also has a catering business. Then we're introduced to some distant relation, an elderly woman named Evanelle with a gift for prophecy. She's known for giving kids band-aids hours before they scrape their knees, quarters before the ice cream truck shows up, and once gave the sisters flashlight weeks before a storm knocked the tree into a power line. Although Claire still isn't sure what the cat bed she received 5 years ago is for. I hate summer because most of them college kids leave town, so there aren't as many renters, and I don't have any nice male backsides to look at when I rock the track. What a mood. She is my favorite character. Evanelle chides Claire for not getting married, but in the same breath chides her for wanting to have routine and clinging too much to the house, like, pick a lane here. She had no idea about the security of having a name until her mother brought her here to this house where her grandmother lived. It's almost like living out on the road is exceptionally traumatizing to a young child or something. How weird is that? But even when Claire did move into the house with her grandmother, people from town identified her as being a Waverly, that she was odd, an outsider, which I'd like to state that Claire was literally 6 years old when people started to say this, and then they wonder why she's so odd. Probably because you people were super rude and talked smack in front of your literal child. Despite how people seem to keep Claire and the entire Waverly family at an emotional distance, Claire makes sure that the readers know that they all crave the ingredients that come from her garden. They all have magical properties, from secret keeping to thoughtful children to being able to see in the dark. But this is a double-edged sword, especially for Claire's catering business, since the locals come to her with really, really specific needs. Claire and Evanelle drive out to the local grocery store when Evanelle takes off to go look at produce. Claire goes into the office to make her delivery of cases of jam and a little something extra on the side for Fred. We then randomly have a third-person point of view switch to Fred. He basically rehashes what we already learned from the few pages that we've been here for, which does not exactly bode well for the rest of the series if we're going to constantly go back to something that happened 5 pages earlier. Ugh. Anyway, he says that the Waverleys have always been quite odd, especially their mother, who dropped her kids off and then died in a car crash a few years after that. But if Fred does have one nice thing to say about Claire, is that she's opened up her family's herbs and flowers for the rest of the town to enjoy. What Claire had given him was a wine. Fred tells the readers that his relationship with his life partner, James, has been dwindling. There isn't a mention of what this wine is for, but it's kind of obvious that it's to try and rekindle whatever has been lost. Fred mainly muses over what food one serves with magic wine, which is a fair question. Later, Claire goes over to the house where she's catering a dinner party that evening. The narration screeches to a halt to describe the layout of the neighborhood, about how it can only be reached by driving through the college campus. It was originally designed this way to keep the professors isolated from the rest of the world, but goes on to say that these days it's mostly young families who enjoy the privacy, quiet, and security. It's not so much that I mind hearing about this, but for sure it's one of those was telling us about your sandwich necessary to the continuation of the story moments. Claire also tells readers that she only hires students since they're usually not local, that the locals would often ask for magic lessons or try to get access to her prophecy-telling apple tree, or the so-called prophecy-giving apples anyway. No idea how true that is. She then sets up for the van and serves Anna's guest. However, Claire can't help but be drawn to a mysterious unnamed man. After a moment, Anna introduces the two of them. The man, Tyler Hughes, is a new hire at the school, but more importantly, he's recently moved to the house right next to the Waverly's place. Claire is socially awkward and doesn't know what to say to him and simply leaves. What a mood. As she's leaving Anna's house, Tyler is randomly standing there. He asks if she has a light, and she produces the letter that Evanel had given Claire when she had arrived that morning. Awkwardly, Tyler tries to excuse away his smoking, claiming that he's trying to cut back. He's down to 2 a day. Not really being able to read the proverbial room, he presses on, compliments Claire's yard, and then says that he mowed the yard for the first time the other day. When she still doesn't respond, he asks if she saw him outside in his underwear in an accident. When Claire still doesn't respond, he compliments her food and tries to give the letter back, but she refuses to accept it, especially considering that it was probably never meant to be hers anyway. When Claire gets home, she finds Evanel waiting on the front step with a box of Pop-Tarts. She said that she was dead asleep when the son urged to give them to Claire struck her and wouldn't let her go back to sleep. She also has other messages that Claire needs clean sheets. Claire tries to get the old woman to stay the rest of the night with her and proposes that the fresh sheets could be for Evanel, but Evanel insisted that things are never for her and that she only wants to go home now that her task is finished. Then another third-person point of view switch to Tyler as he arrives home sometime later. He watches the lady chase her dog down. As Tyler tells the reader, she always does this at least 4 times a day. Dog training lady, look it up. Ugh. Anyway, he then starts to deep dive into himself about how he craves routine so much to the point that he got a job teaching simply to have it year-round, but that his parents never understood his drive for any of that. He bounced around for a while before ending up at the Orion College in Bascom. The internet promised me that this place takes place in North Carolina, although a quick Google search tells me that Bascom isn't a real place. As he walks inside, he thinks for a while about his yard. He knows that it's going to be a problem, especially since the summer semester has yet to start and properly distract him. Tyler also thinks about how he's already pulled multiple children off from the fence that separates his property from the Waverly's property, that they were trying to get to the apples, which is ridiculous in his opinion since there's plenty of apple trees in the college campus that aren't protected by a 9-foot fence topped with points, but the kids insist that the apples are special. As he's examining the corner of his yard, he realizes that there's a bunch of fallen apples there now, which he thinks is weird since he hadn't seen any fallen apples on his side of the yard yet. Although, if you ask me, I think that it would be more noteworthy that the tree wasn't dropping fruit to your side of the yard. Tyler gathers them with the intention of returning them to Claire in the morning, although I have to add that you don't legally have to do that. Fruit that falls into your yard is yours, and if a fruiting tree branch is in your yard, the fruit from that branch is also yours. Although from what Tyler is saying, it doesn't sound like the apple tree grows over the fence. But he does start to eat one of the apples, and then begins to have a dream, so I guess that they are actually magic. Love my Snark, I also offer book editing services where I bring that same approach to your writing. If you prefer a more traditional approach, I also offer professional book editing services. You can contact me on any of my social media platforms if you have further questions about my editing services, including pricing options. This chapter contains discussions about domestic violence, sexual violence, and abortion. Discretion is advised. Chapter 2. Hey, so do you remember all that happened in Chapter 1? I mean, you should, considering that we literally finished talking about it. Yeah, forget about all of that. That's not important right now. Let's jump into something completely unrelated on literally the other side of the country. Granted, I'm willing to hear this out and see where this goes. We did kind of leave off on quite the cliffhanger with Chapter 1, so a little angry about the sudden change in direction. We jump over to Sydney and her 5-year-old daughter, Bay, and boy, is that name a choice. Anyway, Sydney is with a real louse of a man, David. Even though he's gone a lot, he's still expecting for his elderly neighbor to be a snitch about anything unusual going on in Sydney's movements. David has Sydney on a tight schedule, dictating when she's allowed to take Bay to the park and when she's allowed to go grocery shopping. Except that Sydney finally managed to find somebody willing to help her get out from this toxic situation, to put together an escape plan for both of them to get out. At this point, the story stops at playing Sydney's own backstory. She's also from Bascom, but moved to New York some time ago. She bounced around a lot, going from odd job to odd job in different major cities, and somehow ended up in Seattle with David. The narration does not shy away from the fact that David was an abusive jerkwad from the get-go. I'm also pretty certain that he baby-trapped her, if only because he knew that she was planning to rob him blind in order to simply get away. at a restaurant called David's on the Bay. Bay arrived 7 months later, named by David after his restaurant. I don't know how to explain to people that you can pick literally any other name. At this point, I would have been happy with naming the kid Shelly or even Ariel. At least those are actual human names. The entire thing is honestly a walking advertisement for why abortion is so important, because as you can imagine, the abuse only got worse with a baby in the picture. Having a baby never fixes broken relationships. A year after Bay was born, Sydney was sitting and thinking about her own mother, about how she abruptly left Sydney when Sydney was around a year old because she didn't think that she could cut it as a mother. However, Sydney realizes that she doesn't want to be the one who accidentally dumps all of the trauma under her child simply for existing, and that she had to leave but to take Bay with her. Not mentioned is the idea that I'm pretty sure that David would end up killing Bay. It was said earlier that David didn't touch the little girl so long as Sydney did what he told her to do. The implication being to take the punches and not say anything, but there's no way that David would simply leave Bay alone if Sydney wasn't there to protect her. And I honestly hate how quick that this book is to brush aside the idea that Sydney wanted to get away because she didn't want to be a mother, and not the fact that her baby daddy was beating her up and sexually assaulting her. The book briefly brushes over a few previous attempts Sydney had made to get away, but that David always managed to find them. They later went to pick up Bay at daycare, where David had discovered Bay was enrolled, and how he found them. He was charming, and the teachers believed him when he said Sydney had been in a car accident. I don't know when this book is supposed to take place, or what kind of cheap daycare that Sydney had enrolled Bay at, but in this day and age, you can't simply waltz into the child care place and simply grab a child. There are protocols in place. They are in place for exactly this reason. Too many children have been snatched by the Davids of the world. Sydney's last attempt to leave had been 2 years ago, and ever since then she's been smelling various flowers, none of which were local to Seattle. She knew that it was her home, trying to get her back where she belonged. Back in the present, Sydney hustles Bay out from their home as quietly as possible, and they walk through the rain in order to get to where Greta had promised to pick her up, except that she wasn't there. Greta does show up and complains that a neighbor threatened to tow her because she couldn't park there. All of that out of the way, we jump back to Claire. Which, no wait, go back, what happened to Sydney? I'm honestly kind of befuddled over the constant skipping in this. It was 100% a choice, and a wrong one to boot. It's the day after we left off with her, and she's getting ready for another catering event. But when she gets out into her garden, she finds that there's ivy that's popped up rather abruptly. In her witchy botanical sense, it's a sign that something pretty and looked harmless but would take over everything if given the chance. Claire is working to clear the ivy out when Tyler shows up with the apples that had blown into his yard last night. He returns them with the question of how they'd even gotten into his yard in the first place. Claire absently agrees that it must have been the wind that knocked the fruit into his yard. She then describes the tree. It sounds like an old apple tree. And I saw Sir Isaac Newton's apple tree in his home in England. Yes, it's still the same tree. But she goes on to say that sometimes the tree would throw the apples as if for its own entertainment. Sometimes when Claire was young, she'd wake up to find that apples had been flung in through the open window that overlooked the garden. Tyler makes awkward small talk with her and asks if she's lived in Boscombe long. She says that she wasn't born there but moved there when she was 6. He then asks about the people moving in. The news of people in a car full of boxes in the front of her house is odd to her, and she's quick to shoot Tyler from her garden. But as Claire's leaving the garden, she sees even more ivy. In the front garden, Claire sees Bay first and Sydney. Although neither of them are identified to the reader at first, it doesn't take much to figure out who they are based solely on the opening of the chapter. Claire thinks about her own grandmother having to deal with a similar situation with Sydney's and Claire's own mother. She then finally recognizes that yes, this is Sydney, her sister, even if it doesn't look like Sydney, because Sydney is always so put together and this woman is messy, unkempt, and dirty. Sydney kind of seems to brush off exactly why it is that she's there and greets her sister like she isn't on the run from an abusive man who keeps dragging her back to hell. Tyler briefly greets Sydney and explains that he lives next door now. He says that if the sisters need anything, he'll be at home, and promptly leaves. As soon as they're alone, Claire asks why it is that Sydney introduced herself using her actual surname of Waverly, seeing as how it was the main reason why Sydney had originally left for New York. She hated being a Waverly. Sydney says that Bay's surname is also Waverly, although I'm not sure how true that is. With somebody as abusive and controlling as David is, I'm certain he insisted that Bay have his surname. When Sydney expresses surprise over how great that the family house looks, Claire explains that she used the life insurance payout from their grandmother's death to fix the house up. Sydney is shocked to hear that Grandma died, but Claire says that it's been 10 years now and nobody knew where Sydney was. Claire mainly seems upset with the idea that Sydney is as flaky and irresponsible as ever. She doesn't want to end up becoming a mother to Bay simply because Sydney got bored with her child and decided to leave. Sydney's Sydney's upset that Claire would think that about her, but honestly, I kind of get where Claire is coming from. It really sucks being the responsible one and being forced to watch everybody else go flitting about. As Sydney goes to move the car, Claire tells Bay to go inside and eat breakfast. Bay looks like a mixture of both sisters, and it makes Claire hurt to think about all of the evil older sister things that she did. A tiny part of Claire has always worried that her behavior towards her sister is what sent Sydney away, and she hopes that if the two of them stay, that maybe Bay could find a way to heal from all of that. The Pop-Tarts that Evanel had given Claire in Chapter 1 were for Bay. They're her favorite flavor. After Sydney parks the car around the back, she removes the Washington plate so that nobody knows where they'd come from. She also grills her daughter about who she is, where she'd come from, and who her father is. As you can imagine, Bay needed to not answer truthfully to avoid David finding them again. Although this entire thing kind of falls apart with having a 5-year-old going around introducing herself as Bay. I promise that no other child has that name. Ugh. As I sit down in the kitchen, Sydney watches her sister. Much in the same way that Claire had appraised Sydney earlier, the same now happens in reverse. Sydney finds that her sister is the same, yet changed in immeasurable ways. Sydney then brushes over their trip from west coast to east, hardly sleeping except in little bits here and there, and only ever in car parks and Walmarts. Of not really eating anything except for the cheapest imaginable junk food, she feels like she's 5 seconds from breaking down, which is obviously quite understandable. Claire explains that Evanel had come by with new sheets. She says that Sydney's room is still Sydney's room and that Claire has moved into what used to be Grandma's room, that Bay can be in Claire's old room. Upstairs, Sydney thinks about how she used to keep bedsheets knotted together, waiting for when her mother would come back for her. Although looking back, she now can acknowledge that it was a stupid fantasy of a child, because there is a reason why Mummy had left and hadn't taken her kids with her, which is obviously something that Sydney understood a little too well, and why she left. When she finally goes into her old bedroom, Sydney finds it completely untouched yet taken care of and clean. That was the final straw, and she breaks down. She thinks about all that happened in the decade she's been gone, but she also worries about David finding them. If you're interested in reading my own stories, you can purchase my spicy short stories as well as 2 full-length novels on Amazon. If you're not already following me on Reddit, I recommend doing so to stay updated on when I offer free content. Reddit is currently the only place where I'm advertising myself these days. Chapter 3. We jump over to Evanel, and it's not so much that I don't enjoy her as a character, but my problem is that the narration keeps jumping around almost randomly before violently jumping back to the actual plot. It's a weird writing choice. Anyway, as you can imagine, randomly approaching a near stranger to hand them a jar of honey gives you a lot of weird looks. But enough about how outcast she must be. Let's talk about the random grocery store owner from the Chapter 1. Evanel watches him through the window of his shop hours before it's supposed to open. She can tell that the wine given to him to try and help heal his broken relationship either hadn't been used or flat out didn't work. She waits around to see if she feels the need to give him anything, and then is kind of disappointed when she doesn't. The only thing she had was advice at that point, which she found most people to be quite dismissive of. And then, enough talk about this random side character, let's talk about Evanel some. She explains that she gave a boy a rock when they were 6, and he used it to throw it at her window later that night. They eventually got married and spent nearly 40 years together without Evanel having the urge to give him anything. Then she suddenly needed to get him a new suit, if only because he needed one to be buried in. That's ominous and sad. Sometimes at night, when her house felt particularly empty, she still wondered what would have happened if she hadn't bought her husband that suit. Back in the present, Fred notices her standing outside and asks if she has anything to give him. She says no, but then encourages him to give Claire's wine to his husband to try and fix their broken relationship. But it seems as though Fred is too much of a chicken to even try. After leaving Fred, Evanel thinks about going over to see Sydney, and then she's struck with the urge to buy Sydney a shirt. Sydney wakes up from a nap and finds Claire and Bay cooking downstairs. When she sees how much that they'd made, she wonders how they managed so much in about 2 hours. Claire explains that Sydney was out cold for 26 hours and that she'd obviously taken care of her niece during that time. Sydney feels like her sister views her as being a bad mother, but honey, you don't show up looking like a mess and probably pass out for 26 hours without there being something insanely serious. Claire says that she's cooking stuff for another catering event, that she hired some girls to help her out, but that since Sydney needs the money, she can help out instead. Claire is simply grateful for the job, as well as an in with her sister. Sydney then asks about Tyler, but there isn't exactly much to say since Claire herself barely knows him. They also talk about burying the apples that the tree had dropped. This turns the conversation to Bay, who she apparently has a knack for knowing where things belong, which is for knowing where the silverware is kept in a new place, but she also says that this is where Tyler belongs. Sydney is upset and under the impression that Claire is forcing this onto Bae, but Claire is quick to point out that she didn't force Bae to do anything, like how nobody forced Sydney to do anything either. However, Sydney insists that she only wanted to be normal, but that the town wouldn't let her. Later, Evan shows up. At first, she stopped to talk with Tyler for a second. Sydney watched him, but most of her attention was on Tyler. While she found him attractive, she felt too burnt out following everything with David, which I'd like to remind you is certainly going to become a huge problem later on. When Evan comes over, she gives Sydney Tyler's phone number, which he had given to the old lady. She insists that she doesn't know what the purpose of passing the number along is, so Sydney takes it anyway. Evan then gives Sydney the shirt that she bought at the start of the chapter, although she also admits that she knows that it's the wrong size for Sydney. Sydney introduces Bae to Evan. The old woman is like, she has Waverly in her blood, which, no kidding, her mother is one, so obviously she's going to look like everybody else in the family. That's how genetics work, yes. We jump to the sisters arriving home following the catering event. Sydney had only arrived in town 3 days earlier and wasn't ready to leave Bae with Evan, so she brought her with them. Bae had been useful, especially with her knowing where everything belongs power, and the old ladies from the Amateur Botanists Association had left her as well. After putting Bae to bed, Sydney goes downstairs prepared to help Claire clean up, but Claire insists that all of this is her routine. She points to an envelope full of cash, saying that is Sydney's pay. Sydney is randomly upset at having been dismissed so easily. She feels like her sister expects her to get lost, but without a plate for her car, she can't really go anywhere, and it's not like she knows anybody anyway. For lack of anything better to do, Sydney walks over to go bug Tyler. He's still putzing about in his yard but invites her in. Sydney is surprised to see that he's only recently moved in. He tells her a little about himself. Sydney offers to cut his hair, having been to beauty school and therefore qualified to do it. She then asks about Tyler's relationship with Claire, since he seems exceptionally smitten with her. He admits that he had a bizarre dream about her, but abruptly cuts off right before describing how Claire looked in his dream. Sydney tells him that she and Claire were never really close as children and that she burned a lot of bridges when she left a decade earlier. Patreon has recently introduced free memberships. By joining, you'll be able to enjoy the same content I post on Tumblr, now conveniently available on Patreon. Patreon supporters can enjoy even more book Snark starting at only $1 a month. Plus, Patreon now offers a 1-week free trial. Don't miss it. Big shout out to Phoebe for supporting me on Patreon already. Also, a huge thanks to an anonymous donor for making a one-time donation. If you want to hear your name in my video next week, either support me on Patreon or make a one-time donation. Chapter 4. For some unholy reason, we're jumping over to Emma Clark. And look, I get that it can be an interesting narrative tool to cut away from the main plot, but the choices being made in this book are kind of baffling if I'm being honest. Emma Clark is the kind of woman who is groomed from a young age that she needs to marry well, and her husband was basically chosen for her since she was a toddler. When they were 16, her so-called betrothed, Hunter John, met and soon decided to rebel by asking out Sydney Waverly. The adults in their lives laughed over the entire thing, said that Hunter needed to sow his wild oats, so to speak, before he settled down, that they were children and expected to explore a little bit, that Sydney was the pretty Waverly and she was probably safe enough with, "Wow, don't be shy, tell us how you really feel." But Hunter and Sydney were inseparable, and Emma was encouraged to become friends with Sydney, know thy enemy, and all that. The problem was that there was a point where Emma actually liked Sydney. Emma once allowed Sydney to do her hair, and she got so many compliments, but she could never replicate the look no matter how hard she tried. But Emma drew the line when Sydney confessed that she and Hunter were going to do it. Emma was upset because Hunter was supposed to be hers, so she went crying to her mother, and, she remembered how her mother held her and stroked her hair. Ariel was in bed on her white silk sheets. Her room always smelled of candles, and the crystals and the chandelier sent sparkles of light around the room. Her mother was everything Emma wanted it to be, a living, breathing fantasy. Now, Emma, Ariel said easily, you have been doing it, and doing it well, for over a year. All Clark women are good in bed. Why do you think we marry so well? Stop worrying. So she has him right now. You'll have him for the rest of your life. It's just a matter of time. You'll always be better, and it's not good when men have a basis for comparison. It's not to say that you can't spread a little false information. As hard as it is to believe, a lot of women are afraid of the first time. That made Emma laugh. Clark women were never afraid of sex. Yeah, they're 100% under the witch clan, or they're sirens, or succubi, not even pretending to be subtle about that. So Emma told Sydney all this stuff about how much sex hurt as well as the best ways to do it. Wrong! Hunter broke up with Sydney right after high school graduation, and Emma took delight in the pain it obviously caused Sydney. Then she swooped in and snatched up her man. She stopped taking the pill without telling Hunter John, and she got pregnant. Oh, hell no. Look, I get the betrothal thing since she's been groomed into thinking that Hunter was going to be her husband since she was really little, but baby trapping somebody is a serious line. That bitch has gotta go down. After that, everything was sunshine and rainbows in Emma's life, if only because she got the man. They moved into his parents' mansion and literally had their 2.5 kids, which brings us to the worst day in Emma Clark's life. Obviously, this book is not going to come out and immediately say that she had an encounter with Sydney. No, instead it's going to meander through a zit in being forced to wear a different dress to the hospital charity ball. Ugh. There's building up this suspense, but everybody should know what's coming. Telling us about this trivial stuff is so insufferable. And women had handshakes as soft as tea cakes. What the fuck does this even mean? I don't want to grab somebody's hand and it's spongy. Maybe see a doctor about that. At the party, everything looked like it was going well, but Emma felt that sense of wrongness. Trademark. She then went off to Eliza, who I guess is a town gossip. Eliza told her that Sydney was back in town, obviously to try and get a reaction out of her. Emma was ticked off that everybody was looking to her for their small town gossip entertainment, which is fair, but she tries to brush off Sydney's return like it means nothing. Which maybe it works since it has been 10 years. Hunter has been married to Emma and they have 2 kids together. Emma then runs up to her mother, except that the narration has to pause to hammer in exactly how southern that Ariel really is. I am not kidding. She was so southern that she cried tears that came straight from the Mississippi. I'm from the Southwest. Is this seriously something that people from the South actually say? What is happening here? Ariel seems worried about Sydney's return, which obviously sets Emma on edge. She takes her daughter aside and tells Emma that she's to give Hunter a lot of extra attention. Then Ariel will throw her daughter a party to remind Hunter of how wonderful and special that Emma is. Even though Emma protests that she's not worried about Sydney, Ariel is like, you should be. Don't be shy, tell her how you really feel. Although at this point, if Hunter leaves Emma for Sydney, he will be a homewrecker and a villain. Like, what is wrong with you? Yes, I'm a baby trapped you, but holy cow, don't abandon your family simply because an old girlfriend showed up. We skip to after the ball with Emma seducing her husband at their home. She enjoyed sex and she knew she had a gift, a skill in bed. But was her mother right? Was this all she had? If she didn't have this, would he still be here? Yes, sex is great, but holy guacamole on toast, Batman, it shouldn't be the only thing that you bring to the relationship. However, Hunter is convinced that this is Emma either apologizing for having spent too much money or that she's about to ask him to buy something super expensive, which, typical man nonsense, if it isn't right in front of them, he probably doesn't notice. We then jump over to Claire as she gets off of the phone. She feels a sense of wrongness, trademark, about something, but can't quite put her finger on it. Sydney comes in and Claire tells her about the party that Ariel is throwing. She knows that Sydney has history with Hunter and Emma and worries about Sydney coming along to help out. Which, wow, can't see this going well. Why the hell would you hire the sister of your son-in-law's ex-girlfriend to come cater your pay attention to me party? And wow, that sentence was kind of a lot, but you know what I mean. The narration then pauses to describe Sydney from Claire's perspective, except that it sounds more like Sydney is being set up as a potential love interest. The entire thing is baffling since, again, they're sisters. But this quickly shifts into talking about how good of a mother that Sydney is, which is surprising to Claire since obviously their own mother abandoned them and their grandmother wasn't exactly the greatest mother figure in the world. Claire also knows that something must have happened to her sister, that she keeps checking to make sure all of the doors and windows are locked, and Big keeps insisting that she was born on a Greyhound bus and that we live nowhere but also everywhere. She then gets upset when Sydney says that she invited Tyler over to eat with them. Sydney says that Tyler is obsessed with her, that if Claire isn't interested, she needs to tell Tyler herself. Tyler shows up and Sydney leaves to give him a tour of the house. Bae comes along to hug her before she sits down at the kitchen table to eat. Claire thinks about how Sydney is probably only around long enough to get back on her feet, that she'll be out the door again, that Sydney is going out of her way to avoid teaching Bae anything about magic in general, that no matter what might have happened in the past, Sydney is still Sydney. But Claire can try to control that situation. If she has to be rude, so be it. Claire feels jealous when Sydney and Tyler come to sit down to eat, that Sydney has always been good with people, at ease in talking with them. She leaves them to their lunch and goes outside. Tyler finds her complaining to the tree to stop chucking apples onto the ground, that she's only going to bury them. Tyler asks if that's her secret to a good garden, to doctor her plants. Claire complains that she's busy, but Tyler insists that Sydney sent her outside to talk to her regardless, warned him that Claire would say that. Tyler then confesses that he finds Claire beautiful, but she isn't impressed with his compliments and reminds him that she's busy and has a lot on her plate. He insists that he doesn't have much on his plate, implying that he's got plenty of time to win her over. Tread carefully here, book. I do not like a guy who cannot take no for an answer. Claire didn't exactly give him a no, though, so that's why this book isn't quite at the red flag stage yet. Thanks for watching. New Book Snark videos go live every Monday with occasional extras during the week. Your support means so much, even if it's not financial. Watching my videos, subscribing, and liking, and sharing them with my friends all go a long way in helping my channel grow. If you've already caught up with all my videos, you can go to Facebook, WordPress, Tumblr, or free on Patreon for my main book Snarks, always free and updated every morning. A link tree for everything is posted below. See you next week, guys.